She took the most important photograph in the history of science, and the men who used it to win the Nobel Prize never asked her permission. They never even told her they'd seen it. This is the story of Rosalind Franklin, a woman who cracked the code of life itself, and the mistake or the theft that erased her name from history. London, 1952. The city is still scarred from the war, bomb sites, rationing, a world trying to rebuild itself from rubble. But inside a quiet laboratory at King's College London, something extraordinary is happening. A woman in a white lab coat is working alone. No fanfare, no audience, just her equipment, and a question that no one on Earth has answered yet. What does DNA actually look like? Not in theory, not in diagrams, in reality. What is the true shape of the molecule that contains the instructions for every single living thing on this planet? Every human being who has ever existed, every animal, every blade of grass, every virus, every cell, all of it encoded inside one invisible structure. Scientists in the 1950s knew DNA existed. They just had no idea what it looked like. And without the shape, you couldn't understand how it worked. You couldn't understand how traits pass from parent to child. You couldn't understand disease, or inheritance, or life itself. Rosalind Franklin was determined to find the answer. She used a technique called X-ray crystallography. The idea is almost poetic. You fire X-rays at a molecule. The X-rays scatter as they hit the atoms inside, and the pattern they leave behind, like a shadow burned onto film, tells you the shape. Simple in theory, brutally difficult in practice. Franklin was one of the best in the world at it. Meticulous, precise, patient in a way that most scientists simply weren't. She spent months adjusting her equipment, refining her technique, getting everything exactly right. And then, in May 1952, she took a photograph. Photo 51, a ghostly X-shape, glowing against a dark background. Perfectly symmetrical, perfectly clear. An image of DNA so sharp, so detailed, that it contained the answer right there, frozen in light. The answer that two men across England had been desperately searching for. The answer that would make them famous forever. James Watson and Francis Crick were working at Cambridge University. They were brilliant, ambitious, relentless, and they were stuck. Their models of DNA kept falling apart. Their math kept breaking down. A researcher in America named Linus Pauling was closing in fast. The race to solve DNA was real, and Watson and Crick were losing it. Watson had attended one of Franklin's lectures in late 1951. He'd misremembered key details, got the numbers wrong, and their first model collapsed as a result. Franklin had pointed out the errors publicly,
These patterns reveal
politely,
helical structure.
but clearly.
Note the repeating intervals
She was
here.
right.
This confirms
They had
the
been
track
wrong,
mosaic virus model.
and that should have been the end of the story. But then something happened, something that was never supposed to happen. At King's College, Franklin had a colleague named Maurice Wilkins. He was also working on DNA. Different samples, a different approach. He and Franklin had a tense, uncomfortable relationship from the very beginning. Wilkins had initially assumed Franklin was his assistant. She was not. She was an independent researcher. His equal. His superior, in fact, when it came to X-ray work. The tension between them never went away. And in January 1953, without asking Franklin, without warning Franklin, without telling Franklin,
This is
Wilkins
Photo 51
showed
by Rosalind
Watson
Franklin, 1952.
Photo 51.
Her work was the key to
Just showed
discovering
it to him.
DNA structure.
Watson later described the moment in his own memoir. He said his mouth fell open. His pulse quickened. The instant he saw it, he knew. The shape was right there. Two strands wound around each other like a spiral staircase. Every measurement Franklin had spent months perfecting, laid out in that single blurry image. Watson walked out of King's College with the answer in his head, and Rosalind Franklin had no idea it had just happened. But it gets worse. Around the same time, the Medical Research Council had compiled a report on the ongoing DNA research at King's College. Inside that report was Franklin's unpublished data, her measurements, her calculations, her conclusions, data she had gathered over months of painstaking work, data she hadn't published yet. Watson and Crick got access to it. Again, without Franklin's knowledge, they now had her photo, they had her numbers, they had everything they needed. Watson and Crick moved fast. Using Franklin's image as their guide, whether they'd ever fully admit it or not, they built their model, the double helix, two sugar-phosphate backbones on the outside, chemical base pairs stacked on the inside. Like a ladder that someone grabbed at both ends and twisted. It was elegant, it was beautiful, and it was correct. They published their findings in the journal Nature in April 1953. The paper was barely 2 pages long. It would change the world. In the very same issue of that journal, Franklin published her own paper, her X-ray data, her crystallography work, her evidence, the paper that contained photo 51, but it was listed as supporting material, as if it came after their discovery, not before it, as if she had been verifying their idea, not the other way around. She wasn't verifying their idea, she was the source of it. The scientific world exploded with excitement. Watson and Crick were celebrated as heroes, visionaries, the men who unlocked the secret of life. Rosalind Franklin was barely mentioned. She left King's College shortly after, moved to a different institution, started doing brilliant, groundbreaking work on viruses. She never publicly accused anyone of theft. She never wrote a tell-all account. She just moved forward. Maybe she didn't know the full extent of what had happened. Maybe she did, and chose not to fight it. We'll never know, because in 1958, Rosalind Franklin died, ovarian cancer. She was 37 years old. 4 years later, in 1962, James Watson, Francis Crick, and Maurice Wilkins received the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for the discovery of the structure of DNA. The Nobel Prize is never awarded posthumously. Franklin was gone. She was not eligible. She was not mentioned in the ceremony. In his acceptance speech, Watson thanked his colleagues. Not a word about Rosalind Franklin, not one word. Here's the thing about DNA. Everything we know about modern biology flows from understanding that double helix. Cancer research, gene therapy, forensic science, the ancestry test that tells you where your great-great-grandparents came from. The COVID vaccines developed in record time. The ability to read someone's genetic code and predict disease before a single symptom appears. All of it traces back to that structure, traces back to the shape, traces back to photo 51. Rosalind Franklin didn't just contribute to one of the greatest discoveries in science, she made it possible. And here's what makes this story bigger than one woman, bigger than one photograph. This is a pattern. History is full of people whose work was taken, whose names were dropped, whose contributions were quietly absorbed into someone else's legacy. Often women, often people who existed at the edges of power, close enough to do the work, far enough away to receive the credit. Katherine Johnson calculated the orbital trajectories that got American astronauts into space and brought them home alive. For decades, most people had never heard her name. Hedy Lamarr invented the frequency-hopping technology that is the direct foundation of modern Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. She died before the world acknowledged what she had done. Cecilia Payne-Gaposchkin discovered that stars are made mostly of hydrogen, one of the most fundamental findings in all of astronomy. She was pressured to walk back her own conclusion. A male astronomer published the same finding 4 years later and received the credit. Scientists even have a name for this: the Matilda effect, the systematic suppression of scientific contributions made by women. And before you decide this is ancient history, it's still happening today. In labs, in boardrooms, in universities, the work done by one person, the prize handed to another. The only difference now is that we've started to name it, to see it, to refuse to let it disappear quietly. Photo 51 still exists. You can look it up right now. That blurry, ghostly X on a dark background. It doesn't look like much. It doesn't look like the blueprint for all of life on Earth, but that's exactly what it is. Taken by a woman who worked in a difficult environment, surrounded by people who underestimated her, who was meticulous when others were careless, who was precise when others were guessing, who died young, without recognition, without a Nobel Prize, without even knowing the full weight of what she had given the
Rosalind
world,
Franklin. She
and
was
who was
incredible.
right
Yeah, the expert
about
work
everything.
on DNA is so important.
History
Cool poster.
has a long memory. It just takes a while to tell the truth. Rosalind Franklin didn't just take a photograph. She captured life itself. She deserved to be remembered for it. If this story stayed with you, and I think it should, subscribe to History by Accident. Every week on this channel, we find the stories that history tried to bury. The accidents, the oversights, the moments where one small thing changed everything. And I want to hear from you. Do you think what happened to Rosalind Franklin was theft,
Our work
or just the
echoes
brutal
lineage of
reality
women in
of
science.
how science worked back then? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. And if you know someone who has never heard her name, send them this video, because the least we can do is say it.